The Committee for Campus Inclusion was created in 1990 at Arizona State University. The mission of CCI is to create and maintain a civil and just campus environment that values diversity, promotes respect for all individuals regardless of their status, protects free speech and academic freedom, and promotes the pursuit of individual goals without interference from discriminatory harassment. CCI continues to advance this mission through educational experiences, essential to an institution of higher education. Furthermore, we recognize and celebrate those who are working to further the vision of diversity and inclusion, while also providing recommendations to the Vice Provost for inclusion and community engagement on issues related to diversity and inclusion. While diversity addresses the number of individuals that represent a range of human differences, inclusion encompasses creating a welcoming environment where all persons within our university community can thrive and succeed as articulated through our university charter. Welcome to today's episode, Inclusion and Technology, from the Make Me Your Voice podcast, sponsored by ASU's Committee for Campus Inclusion at the Tempe campus. Today's program focuses on how technology can enhance or create challenges for many communities as we transition to online learning. Our guest is Amy Pate, an Assistant Director of Faculty Support at the School of Life Sciences, and has led a number of workshops on creating inclusive courses online.
So first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak for the CCI podcasts. I think these podcasts are so critical to allow employees, students, staff, faculty members, members of our community at Arizona State University to be able to share opinions, ideas, and interests about diversity and inclusion. And I'm excited today to be able to talk to you about something that I've been really passionate about for the last couple of years, and something that I've been asked to speak at conferences about quite often when it comes to education and technology, which are two of my interests. Something that I've noticed as we've we've moved away from a face-to-face classroom into more online classrooms, it becomes really critical that we look at avatars and simulations and content that we put on the web as being inclusive and showing a diversity of people. I really think this is critical, and I think that often at ASU, we have really focused on how to create inclusion and support diversity in our classrooms, but we haven't really talked about how that translates into the online beyond accessibility. So I'm hoping that this will give you some ideas to think about and to be perhaps more aware of the simulations that you use in your classrooms and that you see in your classrooms. My focus has been on biology classes, so some of the examples I use are going to be from biology, but they really apply to whatever kind of simulations you're using. A lot of faculty are using Powtoons, beyond various animation tools, and this hopefully will open up some ideas for you to think about as you're creating. So before I get into the heart of my presentation, what I'd like you to do is just take a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds, and think about in the back of your head, what does a scientist look like? Okay, do you have that image in your head? Usually what comes first to mind for anybody in the US is Einstein. That seems to be kind of our model of what a scientist looks like. Usually a European older male person, maybe with the crazy white hair that kind of alludes towards that mad scientist look. And that seems to be what we show oftentimes in our simulations. But the truth is, we all know this from a logical point of view, that scientists can look like anybody. They can be any skin tone, they can be any gender, they can be from anywhere in the world. They can even wear different clothing. They don't all wear lab coats all the time. So it really becomes critical that that aspect becomes reflected in our classes in terms of online environments. And especially, I think this is really important as we are teaching students who are perhaps more involved with doing online video games where they're creating avatars and kind of personalizing their avatars, to even text messaging where they've chosen to use Bitmoji, where their little icon looks very similar to how they see themselves personally. And hopefully this will also translate into some of our simulations and animations that we're using. Take a minute if you're a faculty member, and if you're a student, think about it, but think about the ideas of what images are we putting up there in our courses that perhaps reflect bias in some way. If you're a faculty member, maybe images that you're choosing. If you're a student, maybe it's images that you see in your class. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we did in the School of Life Sciences to kind of start thinking about this diversity issue, inclusive issue. One thing that happened with our online courses is that we decided to use a company called Labster for simulations. And their simulations were excellent. But we noticed that there were biases within these particular simulations. Things were happening like there were more males represented as scientists than females. There were some issues with power dynamics where usually the male was the lead research person as opposed to a female assistant. We also noticed there were things with stereotypes in some of the simulations. Again, could be due to gender where a female was seen as an assistant, but we were also noticing things in terms of people of color were often shown in more, in this case, like field work or things where they weren't seen as scientists necessarily. And then the final thing is that we noticed some microaggressions happening. Now, ASU has been really great about really thinking about microaggressions that happen in a classroom environment. And so faculty are fairly well trained on that. But in a simulation, again, some of those things get lost. So in this particular case, an example I can give you is that we had a female avatar walk into a lab, and the question that popped up on the screen is, what's wrong with Lucy? So rather than trying to figure out why she wasn't dressed appropriately, which was really what our question or objective was for this, we asked what's wrong with her. And it was an attempt to be funny, but it wasn't funny, it was a microaggression. So the question popped up with, look at her and determine what's wrong with her. Oh, she has terrible taste in fashion, she walks strangely, she talks to herself, or she's not dressed appropriately for a lab. And the obvious answer is that she's not dressed appropriately for a lab, but when we really dove down into this, we realized it's really a microaggression against this avatar, Lucy. So what did we do? When we started realizing that these things were popping up, what did we start doing? We began to figure out a framework for assessing images and avatars and to make sure that we kept the bias down as much as possible. At ASU, we were really lucky because we actually brought in two experts from ASU, Renee Klug and Sarah Brunel, to talk to our team and to help us begin forming a group of people who would really look at simulations to make sure that they were being inclusive and that we were showing diverse people within it. We also invited our partner Labster to join with us in this team as a way for them to also learn what we were seeing, but also a way to make change for the future. The team itself developed what we called the 8 shared standards, and those standards worked for both language and also visuals. It was actually based on various standards around across the nation for online courses in terms of inclusion. But the one I liked the most recently came up was Peralta Online Equity Rubric. I highly recommend that if you're supporting courses, you take a look at that. Specifically, there's 3 standards that they use that talk about diversity and inclusion, images and what's represented, and also human bias. So I think that's a good one to look through. Now, we developed these standards, we shared them with Labster, and I'm going to go through them one by one with you. So the first standard we decided is that in language, we wanted a non-judgmental approach. So again, going back to that case I told you where an avatar walked into the room and we said, what's wrong with her? That's a judgmental question. And what we should have asked instead is Lucy ready to work in a lab based on what she's wearing, right? And that would be a much more specific answer. So we want to use literal facts that are observable, not judgments or interpretations based on what someone thinks. So that's the first standard. The second standard focuses on language again, but in terms of empathy. We really wanted to make sure that our avatars were talking to each other with empathy. And in our case, we were using doctors and they were talking to patients. Sometimes those patients were put into very difficult situations. One example would be where a pregnant mother came in and she was having to make a decision based on her, the fetus having birth defects. And so that's a very traumatic experience in anybody's life. And we felt like the doctors and the avatars weren't really being empathetic. They were just very cold and were focusing on the procedure, not on the patient. So we decided that that was a standard number 2 that we wanted. And then standard number 3 is the way the avatars looked and that became our value of diversity. So the third standard that we looked at was gender. So in other words, we wanted to make sure that in our simulations, first of all, there was an awareness of power dynamics within the genders. There were no longer using stereotypes. And we even started considering using non-binary avatars. So we experimented with all those things. One thing that really I thought was quite interesting was the fact that we were up against using an assistant in the lab, which was clearly female, versus what changed was we started using a drone. We called her Dr. One, but she had a female voice. And I think it's really critical to know that this is a controversial issue from a lot of times in technology. And I'm going to just show you a quick clip and see if you can figure out what I'm talking about. So something that comes up quite regularly when we're talking about voice drones or voice assistants is their gender. And so I want you to listen for just a second.
Born September 23rd, 1949, is an American singer-songwriter known for his work with the E Street Band.
So that should just give you an example of what we were thinking about in terms of voices for genders. It's a controversial issue that a lot of people don't think about, but the idea that assistants are usually female and they have female voices. So we really wanted to make sure that we were thinking about that when we chose simulations as to how do we perceive women in these roles. We also looked at what we call non-binary avatars, and that had mixed reviews. We had students kind of get distracted by the fact that the avatars were not male or female and lose a little bit of connection to the content and the focus on what was needing to be done. But it was interesting. Again, we were trying out various experiments to show different avatars. The fourth standard that we looked at was family structure. So again, it became really important to us that in simulations, we used non-traditional families. So those families might include single moms, grandparents, same-sex parents. In fact, one of the simulations where there was an IVF where one partner's eggs were used to create embryos and then were carried by the other parent. I think it's really important that we show that that diversity is embraced in our simulations that we use. The fifth standard that we looked at was race and ethnicity. So certainly one of the things we noticed often were that avatars had the pale skin we really promoted the idea that avatars of doctors could be Black or Hispanic scientists. We wanted to show that variety and avoid stereotypes. So when we did show Black avatars, that they were in positions of authority. The sixth standard that we looked at was culture. This was a little bit tricky because we had some simulations where scientists were actually going into various countries where there might be indigenous people, and we wanted to make sure that those indigenous avatars were shown accurately and that our scientists showed respect towards the different communities that they were in. So our culture standard really emphasized the idea that avatars show respect for community and for elders within indigenous people. Our seventh standard that we looked at was religion. And again, we said, hey, so often scientists are really shown as either not embracing religion or, again, a more traditional Christianity type of religion. So scientists, we felt, should really reflect the broad range of religions and respect diverse beliefs. And so we encouraged Labster to consider using avatars that had different headgear on them or scarves around their faces to show, again, possible difference in terms of religions. And then the eighth standard, we looked at abilities. So the idea that we wanted to show that our labs in simulations were accessible to a variety of people. So we wanted lab tables that could accommodate wheelchairs, the use of listening devices, and closed captioning within videos in terms of how the avatars were reacting to each other, as well as within the lab environment. Those of you that aren't familiar with science, lots of times you have to weigh certain specimens. And in accessible labs, the weight scale is verbal. So it'll tell you that it's 1.5 pounds or whatever it is. So we wanted that to be reflected in the lab environments that these avatars were in. So to give you kind of a brief overview of how this process worked, I'm going to include one of our team members, Tiffany, who's going to talk to you a little bit about what her experience was as she used this framework to evaluate simulations.
Hi, my name is Tiffany. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. For the past few years, I've been working with Amy, the Teaching Innovation Center, and Labster to develop and improve virtual reality online laboratories. The goal is to create labs that meet the learning outcomes of in-person courses. The early days were focused on content. The designers created real-world narratives that our students can relate to. The empathy and relatability towards the avatars led to the creation of the inclusive review team, which I was a part of. One of the things I found myself most attentive to were the emotions and feelings potentially evoked by the labs, as well as the representation of various bodies. And one of the big things I really appreciated about working with this group was the action that was taken based on our feedback. I feel like we were heard and that our ideas were important. A great example of this for me was when I was asked to review an animal physiology lab that used a seal, like the marine mammal, as an avatar. And I'm also a marine biologist and have worked with sea lions in my past. And I was concerned about the portrayal of the care of the seal. And the woman who had created the lab took note of all of my concerns and was very attentive to what I had to say. I really can't ask more than that. It's been a great group to work with. Last year we were nominated for an award. We didn't get it, but it was such an honor to be nominated. And I really appreciated working with this team. And I'm grateful that ASU is considering these things moving forward.
So I hope that gave you some insights as to how that worked. I loved her story about the Arctic animals, the seals. Moving forward, here's where we kind of are. We definitely have had fewer student complaints now that we've really taken this seriously. We're still not perfect, but I think we're improving, and we found that sometimes we're even adding additions to these frameworks that we hadn't been aware of before. We've started training faculty in this awareness, and our inclusion team is regularly called upon to look at various simulations and things that are being done in our school. What I'm really most proud of is that in working with our partner Labster, they really embraced the idea of what we were trying to come across. And my understanding is they actually promoted our framework within their company, because they wanted their developers to really have this awareness of how we were treating avatars. So a great quote that they gave me was, they created guidelines for designing more inclusive simulations, characters, conversations, and storylines that all content designers are following right now. So that has been integrated not only in the simulations we are developing in collaboration with ASU, but also for any new simulation we create. For me, that really says it all, that ASU led the way, and then we've now created this framework for other schools to follow and be more inclusive in their designs. So where do we go from here? What I'm hoping is that as you start using some various technologies, that you'll be aware of how those simulations, those animations are looking. There's so many products out there right now that you can use for animations, everything from Adobe Spark, Powtoon, certainly Beyond is one that I've used quite a bit. Each one of these comes with different little biases towards often male Caucasians. So when you use those products, I would highly recommend that you take a quick second to look at them. Oftentimes what I have seen are women who are assistants. There may be some people of color, but they may not be seen in power. And oftentimes, especially in biology labs, the skin color is mostly white and mostly male. So one of the recommendations that I would make is in Beyond, VYOND is a product that you can use to make animations. There is a special feature that you can allow the characters to wear more traditional attire rather than our kind of American suit and business tie. And I highly recommend that even though that's buried down a little in a few layers, you take a few moments to think about how you want to show your avatars and really make them appropriate, make them diverse and inclusive. I really think that this is a critical topic that perhaps not enough people have thought about it. So take a minute. I'm going to give you a couple of questions to rethink how you're looking at this. One question could be, how would you use our framework in your particular area, your discipline? Number two, maybe looking at these guidelines that I've given you, are they enough? Could there be more added to it? And number three, how would you create this process, again, within your own school or your department? Do you have a team of people that are looking at your course content for that diverse, inclusive mindset? And I'll leave you with one last thought. One of my favorite professors, when I bring this up, said to me initially, oh, you know what, this diversity stuff is so hard. He said, I'm just going to make all of my avatars be like characters in Star Wars. And immediately I laughed, because even Star Wars, we all know now, have biased characters. And so it is not the design of the avatar, it's the person who's designing the avatar that needs to have that mindset and that awareness to have inclusive and diverse characteristics and embrace those. So that's my talk for today. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to discuss it, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. In addition to being present here, CCI invites you to join our mailing list by emailing us at ccicontact@asu.edu and visit our website at inclusion.asu.edu/cci.